Well, thank you for the invitation to come and speak, and it's really an honor, actually, to be the, let's try this, to be the final speaker in this illustrious panel. So in my talk today, what I wanted to do, aside from flagging 3 steps I think we could take in the scientific community to help resolve this problem, I also wanted to bring attention to the intellectual framing that we actually have for the problem of reproducibility. So what I'm going to spend my few minutes on is trying to tease out notions that I've labeled empirical reproducibility, computational reproducibility, and statistical reproducibility. And the reason I think this framing is important is that the solutions that attend to each of these different lenses are different. And I can guarantee you that if I asked anybody in the audience what they think of reproducibility really is, I'd get N different answers. And so my idea is this will help parse out the discussion in a way that we can really make progress on each of these. Okay, so I'll just go quickly through this. We all know that there's been a credibility crisis around the notions of reproducibility, and this slide is just meant to highlight how it's not just a conversation that we're having in the scientific community. This is something that reaches out across society broadly, and so putting our ducks in a row and dealing with these issues as we're doing today is really something that not just improves science, but is something that the larger community across society is paying attention to. Okay, so these ideas of reproducibility. So empirical reproducibility, briefly, and I'll talk a little bit more in detail, this is our traditional notion of what it means to do, say, for example, bench science or an experiment with a survey, where you actually get out and you carry out science in this, the traditional way that we've thought about how science is conducted for hundreds of years. You can see this philosophy reflected, for example, in this Nature editorial, "We must try harder to resolve issues of reproducibility." In the sense, embedded in that discussion is this context that we've got it right what we're doing. We have the right values around reproducibility. We're just not somehow acting on them the way we should as a community. So I wanted to compare this with what I'm calling computational reproducibility. So the idea here is that, and I'll spend more time talking about this in a moment, but the idea is that use of computational methods has really changed the way that we need to think about the scientific discovery process and the types of dissemination that we actually envisage for the scholarly record. And so that's discussions around, for example, open data, open code, computational reproducibility touches on all those issues. The final, and I think all these 3 concepts are overlapping, the final source of irreproducibility that I'd like to highlight is statistical reproducibility. I'll say more as I go through my remaining 8 minutes, whatever it is. Okay, empirical reproducibility. A couple of quick examples. Many people, I believe, today are talking about this notion of irreproducibility. I won't spend a lot of time on it. I just wanted to highlight this paper, Sorting Out the Facts, A Devil in the Details. So in trying to reconcile results that were being produced in a lab at Berkeley and a lab at Harvard, they thought it would take about 2 months to make sure that the samples that were coming from each of the labs did not have a signature with which you could identify the source, like the lab that it came from. It ended up taking them 2 years, and they had to unpack their entire discovery process in the lab and found out that, roughly speaking, I'm not a life scientist, that one lab was actually stirring a beaker, another lab was putting it in a centrifuge, and this was creating signature differences in the output that took that long to discover. There's just so much tacit knowledge in what we do. The other image here is from a National Academies workshop in 2014, talking about what do we do about reproducibility when there are animals involved in the study. So just to highlight that there's many dimensions, and we think about reproducibility as this global good in science, which it's of course a cornerstone. However, there are sometimes very big costs associated with reproducibility depending on what types of questions you're asking and how you carry out the science. Okay, computational reproducibility. I'll go through these slides relatively quickly because of the short amount of time. However, the slides are on my website. If you're interested in many of the things I'm going to talk about are hot linked, so you may want to just grab them right off my website. So if we think about our traditional conception of how we carry out science, we've had 2 branches of the scientific method. So branch 1, branch 2, long-standing hundreds of years that we've had the deductive branch, mathematics and formal logic, and this of course fell short for many studies, so we developed the inductive or empirical branch of the scientific method where we have statistical analysis of controlled experiments. I'm sure everyone in this room has heard the discussions around we have new branches of the scientific method, the third branch of scientific method around computational science, fourth branch around data-driven discovery and the data deluge, for example. So I put a little question mark there because what I want us to think about is whether or not these are really rising to the level of branches of the scientific method. And I'll elaborate a little bit on what I mean. But just to note, in 1995, here's a workshop on modeling and simulation where they're stating it's common now to consider computation as a third branch of science besides theory and experiment. Many people are probably familiar with the 2009 Fourth Paradigm book, an edited volume sponsored by Microsoft. Just in the preface, this book is about a new fourth paradigm for science based on data-intensive computing. Okay, so we have data driving changes in how we carry out science and consequently how we disseminate science. We have very powerful computers that are enabling not just simulations and new types of scientific discovery at the high end, but really all the way through the tail of science, radically changing how we store data, how we collect data, the types of questions that are open for us to ask and to answer. Those two I think people know. The third one people rarely talk about, which I think is just as important as the first two technological changes. Much of our research, our scientific knowledge is now being encoded in software. So bona fide scientific contributions appearing really only in the scripts, the data analysis, and the methods in the software that is actually underlying the data discovery. So for things like reproducibility, there's take-home point one. I think software is a first-class object, just like data, just like the publication, and I don't think we're really addressing the issues around reproducibility until we treat software as we're treating data and really connect all those dots so that we are publishing reproducible research. Okay, so the conclusion is we have well-defined methods for a proof in the first branch of the scientific method. You wouldn't think of publishing a mathematical result without explaining how you could actually get to that result. Second branch, a whole structure and machinery of hypothesis testing that goes along with how we do this statistical analysis of controlled experiments, appropriate statistical method, and a very structured way that we communicate the results. If you, of course, try to publish a paper and you leave the methods section blank, it'll be immediately rejected without being read, right? So these two branches have had hundreds of years to think about what the appropriate dissemination standards are for that type of research. For research that involves a computer, which is what I'm calling computational science, which is almost all research now, I think these third and fourth branches, as we're talking about, need to have comparable standards before they can really rise to what we would call a branch of the scientific method. We've had maybe 10, 20 years to be thinking about this. So stepping forward and having this discussion that we're having today, I think, is the types of things we need to do to really bring this up to real branches of the scientific method. Okay, so I'm going to skip a couple of slides here. I wanted to draw your attention that folks have been talking about this issue in different aspects of the scientific community, experimental mathematics, producing a workshop on how we can step towards reproducibility, even in very sort of compute-intensive research, talking about how we can engage on reproducibility issues in computational science. I also wanted to bring your attention to many, many tools that are being developed to try and enable reproducibility in computational science. Can I get your code? Can I apply it to your data? Can I get the figures in your paper? This is the sort of most baseline way we can deal with reproducibility in computational science. And I'll just mention that most of these on here, I think there's maybe one or two for which this is not true, these are just faculty members who are frustrated with the current situation, who have stepped out and tried to start to solve the problem and just built this stuff on their spare time. As I mentioned, they're hot linked, so go ahead and click in. And by the way, the list is hopelessly incomplete too. More and more it's coming up. Okay, I've been working on Research Compendia. I won't take time to dig into what that actually is, but what it does is it tries to link code, data, and the publication in a bundle that permits reproducibility. So that's take-home idea too. We need to get that triple link together in how we actually communicate and disseminate the science that has any type of computational aspect to it at all. Okay, so I'll leave you to explore this on your own time. I'll make a note that as Michelle mentioned in the introduction, one of my fields of study is law, particularly intellectual property, and how we're sharing code, how we're sharing data, terms of use, intellectual property rights is a very important aspect that I've been doing some research on. making this as permissively open as possible, preserving issues like citation, I think is a very important step for how we do this sharing. Okay, let me skip this study, which I think is important. I'll just call out ACM, TOMS, transactions on mathematical software. They're doing this independent replication that Brian called out. Other journals are stepping towards this, like, for example, the journal Biostatistics actually does this, and then they'll kite mark the replicated results. So far, the feedback I get is it's going well. Notions of statistical reproducibility, so I'm right about to wrap up. Things like false discovery, low power, experimental design issues, poor statistical methods, all of this starts to permeate this computational science as we do work that derives from data, and our results and inference derive from data as well. So it becomes of heightened importance. I'm going to skip the very important steps that Science Magazine has taken and just close with a few remarks. So I believe that there's a failure in our traditional reporting methods, our traditional publication methods, and we haven't adapted to the role of the computer from very small scale experiments and research right up to large scales in the dissemination and linking to code and data and other scholarly objects. I believe that if we required power calculations, disclosure of negative results, which could be solved through tools and workflow environments, we would probably knock out 80 to 90% of the research that's irreproducible in the scholarly record today. Combined with code and data disclosure, I can see what you've done in the code. I can see that the methods that you've talked about in the paper actually match your implementation. Benchmarking and testing, we don't have a sense of how we test these results, how we benchmark. And the other thing that I wanted to mention is we've got this collective action problem, which is why discussions like this are so important. Whose responsibility is this? We've heard institutions, we've heard funding agencies, we've heard journal editorial boards, we've heard researchers, promotion and tenure committees. They'll all pass the buck a little bit between each other. So we've got this large collective action problem to solve. And I'll leave you with some dream applications. So I think our focus is on what happens when we have scientific research being produced in this era of radical transparency. Now imagine that the code is available, the methods are available, the data is available for these publications in the scholarly record. Then what? We can do things like query the scholarly record, show me a table of effect sizes and p-values in all phase 3 clinical trials for melanoma published after 1994. We can't do that today. We can't make that query. Name all the image denoising algorithms ever used to remove white noise from the famous Barber image and give me the citations. Also an impossible query today. List all the classifiers applied to the famous acute lymphoblastic leukemia data set along with their type 1 and type 2 error rates. Again, I can't get this information. Wouldn't it be interesting to know that? Create a unified data set containing all published whole genome sequences identified with mutation in the gene BRCA1. Randomly reassign treatment and control labels to cases in published clinical trial X and calculate effect size. Repeat many times and create a histogram for these effect sizes. Perform this for every clinical trial published in the year 2003. List the trial name and the histogram side by side. So thinking about our lodestars and where we actually want this radical transparency to bring us, I think we want to be thinking about questions like this and the types of uses that we have for the scholarly record. And I'm sure I'm over time, so thank you very much.